My name is Lena, and I live in a small, quiet village hidden deep in the woods. It's the kind of place where everyone knows each other and the air always smells like pine trees and fresh earth. Life here is simple. I don't have a grand house or a lot of wealth, but I have enough. Enough to live comfortably, enough to share with others, and enough to keep my spirits high. My neighbours are kind-hearted, always stopping by with something to share. Fresh bread, homemade jam, or a good story. On this particular morning I set out, as usual, to gather firewood. The chill of the autumn air wrapped around me like an old, familiar blanket. I loved the mornings in the forest, the way the fog hung low, and the trees stood tall and silent, as if watching over me. I was alone, but I didn't mind. The quiet was peaceful, a contrast to the bustle of the village. As I walked deeper into the woods, something caught my eye. At first it was just a glint of something unusual peeking through the leaves. Curious, I bent down to take a closer look. There, half buried in the earth, was an old pot. It was large, with a strange weight to it, and its edges were worn, as though it had been there for centuries. I pulled it free from the ground, dusted it off, and peered inside. I almost couldn't believe my eyes. Inside the pot, glittering in the soft light of the morning, were gold coins, shiny, beautiful gold coins that reflected the sunlight in such a way it looked as if the pot was filled with stars. My heart raced as I reached in to touch one. It felt real. Could this really be happening, I wondered? The excitement and the possibilities rushed over me like a wave. This is it. This is my chance. For a moment I imagined a life of luxury, living in a big house with a warm fireplace, never worrying about money again, having everything I ever dreamed of. But the weight of the pot soon pulled me back to reality. It was heavy, much heavier than I expected. I had to carry it home, but how? The thought of leaving it behind was unbearable. The moment I realized how heavy the pot was, my excitement shifted to frustration. The coins inside were still gleaming, but the pot itself was so large and cumbersome that I couldn't imagine carrying it all the way back to my home. I tried lifting it with both hands, but it wouldn't budge. The thought of leaving this treasure behind was almost too much to bear. My mind raced, searching for a solution. Then I spotted a few old wooden planks lying nearby. They had clearly been there for years, worn by the elements, but still sturdy enough to help. Inspiration struck me like a bolt of lightning. I had an idea. I gathered the planks, tied them together, and created a makeshift sled. It wasn't elegant, but it would work. The pot would sit on top, and I could drag it behind me. With the sled ready, I attached the pot and began to pull. The path was uneven and rocky, and every tug felt like a small battle, but I couldn't stop now. I kept telling myself that it would be worth it once I got home, once I had the gold and everything I'd ever wanted. I imagined the luxury, the comfort, the freedom, but the more I pulled, the heavier it seemed. The sled scraped against the forest floor, making a constant creaking noise that seemed to mock my every step. Still, I refused to give up. The thought of returning to the village empty-handed wasn't an option. I kept moving forward, my arms aching, my back sore, but the promise of a better life kept me going. As I dragged the pot along, something strange began to happen. The coins inside it no longer gleamed with their golden brilliance. Instead, they started to change. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, they turned into silver. I paused and stared at the pot, a knot tightening in my stomach. Silver, I thought. It wasn't gold anymore, but it was still valuable, right? Still worth something. I convinced myself that it was just a little setback, nothing I couldn't handle. The longer I dragged the pot, the more uncertain I became. The silver coins, which had seemed like a blessing at first, now felt like a disappointment. They weren't the shimmering gold I had dreamed of. They were dull and lifeless. But I told myself that silver was still worth something. I could still use it to make my life better, to buy what I needed, and maybe even help my neighbours in ways I'd always wanted to. But as I moved further down the winding path, the coins began to change again. This time they didn't turn into silver, they turned into iron. Cold, hard iron. The bright gleam of gold was gone entirely. My heart sank as I stared at the pot, now filled with dull, dark iron coins. They had lost all their value. Everything I had hoped for, everything I had imagined, seemed to fade in that instant. I stopped in my tracks, exhausted and disheartened. The excitement I had felt earlier was gone, replaced by a heavy sense of loss. What now, I thought? All my dreams of a better life, of comfort and security, seemed to vanish with the transformation of the coins. The iron felt like a burden, heavier than the pot itself. Sitting on the cold ground, I felt a deep sense of despair. Why had this happened, I wondered. The gold had been a symbol of hope, of a future filled with possibilities. But now it was gone, replaced by something worthless. I couldn't help but feel betrayed by the very thing I thought would save me. But then, as I sat there in the woods, the quiet enveloping me, something inside me shifted. I began to think about the life I already had, the one I had lived before I found the pot. As I sat there, lost in thought, I realized something important. I thought about the village, about the small but meaningful things that made my life rich. I remembered how my neighbours would bring me fresh bread or share their stories, how we would sit together laughing over a hot cup of tea, not because we had everything, but because we had each other. I realized that all the wealth I needed was already in my life. The love of the people around me, the simple joys of a cosy home, and the warmth of a fire on a cold night, these things were worth far more than gold or silver. The pot, with all its promises of wealth and luxury, had led me to understand that true happiness doesn't come from what you have, but from the relationships you nurture and the contentment that comes from within. With a deep breath, I decided it was time to leave the pot behind. It wasn't the answer I had hoped for, but it had taught me a valuable lesson. I stood up, brushed the dirt from my knees, and left the pot where I found it. I didn't need its riches anymore. I had everything I truly needed right here, with me. That evening, as I sat by my fire, feeling the warmth spread through my bones, I knew that I had found something far more precious than gold: peace. The simple, quiet happiness of a life lived in gratitude, surrounded by people who cared. And that, I realized, was the true treasure.